They once declared that Africa's wheels could never turn without first kneeling for fuel. They said our children's legs must bear the weight of miles beneath a punishing sun, even as billions vanished to send cold machines into the sky. Yet today, in the heart of Ouagadougou, 155 gleaming new buses stand ready enough to carry 250,000 students to school every single day. Built without a single coin from the IMF, these engines do not simply growl with diesel. They thunder with defiance. This is more than transport. It is a declaration that our future will never again be outsourced. If a nation as small as Burkina Faso can make this happen, what excuse remains for the giants of our continent? Tell me where you are watching from and subscribe not for entertainment but to join a continental awakening led by Ibrahim Traoré. For generations, public transportation in Burkina Faso was not so much a service as it was a wager with luck. In the capital, the fortunate ones might squeeze themselves into a minibus that groaned and clattered like an overworked drum, its frame held together more by wire and whispered prayers than by metal. In the countryside, the concept of a timid was a foreign luxury. A battered market truck might pass your village once a week, and if it was already full, your only choice was to walk. For children, this was more than an inconvenience. It was a barrier made of time and distance. Across the open savanna, boys and girls would rise long before the first blush of dawn, their small feet pressing through the cool earth, raising little clouds of red dust in the dim light. Their morning path was not a road of promise, but an exhausting trial that slowly wore away their will. Many never made it past the first term in school, not because their minds could not grasp the lessons, but because the daily journey drained them of strength and hope. Dreams were not measured in ambition, but in kilom. And for too many, the road to the future was simply too far to walk. It was into this long shadow of absence and resignation that the 155 buses arrived. The day they were unveiled was not merely an entry on the national calendar. It was a day that felt like the breaking of a long fast, a sudden rain after years of waiting. From the first light of morning, crowds began to gather in Ouagadougou, drawn by whispers and excitement to witness something entirely new. An entire fleet of brand new public buses all at once, all for them. The sun climbed steadily, its light spilling over rows of gleaming machines, their fresh white and green paint reflecting like ripples of river water. Each bus carried the scent of unmarked seats, the clean tang of metal untouched by rust, and an unspoken promise that countless journeys would begin here, unbroken, uncut short. The air trembled with the rhythm of traditional drums, their deep heartbeat weaving through the crowd. Go sang of kings and warriors, their verses now adding the name of a leader who fought battles not only with weapons but with vision. Children in pressed uniforms waved tiny flags, their laughter running alongside the drum beats. Many had never stood so close to a bus before. Some reached out tentative fingers to touch the cool metal as if confirming that this dream had taken solid form. Near the front, an elderly woman leaned on a carved wooden cane, her frame weathered by decades of work in the fields. Her eyes glistened, though her voice was steady. She spoke of her own school days of walking 10 km each way under the punishing sun, only to be pulled from class and sent back to the land. Looking at the buses, she whispered a prayer. Each of these, she said softly, is a pair of wings. Wings for the children, wings for the nation. Those around her listened in silence, some crossing themselves, others lifting their palms to the sky. In that moment, the buses were no longer machines. They were vessels carrying something far heavier than passengers. They were carrying possibility itself. Yet, in the midst of celebration, an unspoken question lingered. Was this just about buses, or was it about carrying an entire nation out of the shadows for a people long told that progress must be imported, that change must be delivered from elsewhere. The sight of these 155 buses was both a relief and a challenge. If such a transformation could be achieved with no foreign strings attached, what else could be within reach? I want you to hold the weight of this moment no matter where you are. If you believe that investing in children is the most powerful weapon against poverty, type Amen in the comments. Let this not be just another story you scroll past, but a vow we make together that the future of Africa's children will not be determined by the length of the road. Engines rumbled to life one by one, their voices merging into a single rolling hum that spread like distant thunder across the square. Drivers in crisp uniforms took their places, hands gripping the steering wheels with the control of someone holding the reins of a strong, willing beast. The first bus eased forward, then another and another, still the line flowing like a single living body. Children chased alongside, laughing, waving their bare feet, leaving prints in the warm red dust. When the first wheel turned onto the open road, it pressed down on paths that had carried bare feet for generations too long. Beyond the cheering crowd, beyond the city limits, beyond the dust dancing in the sun, the road stretched toward villages where this sound, the deep purr of an engine, had never been heard before. And somewhere over that horizon, a village waited, unaware that its silence was about to be broken by the sound of hope on four wheels. The wheels were turning now, and they carried more than students. They carried the certainty that this time the journey would not end before the destination. The first bus reached the village just as the first light of sunrise spilled across the horizon. Its headlights cut through the thin veil of mist, still clinging to the acacia trees, and its tires pressed into a road that until this very morning had only known the weight of bicycles, donkey carts, and the bare calloused feet of those who had no choice but to walk. For years, this place had been bypassed by the promises of public service. Pledges had arrived like the dry season clouds, swollen with words empty of rain, and then drifted away. But today, the air carried something entirely different. The low, steady rumble of a diesel engine, the unmistakable sound of arrival. Musa heard it before he saw it. 17 years old, tall for his age, but his shoulders curved forward from the years spent hauling his school books, a worn water bottle, and sometimes his younger sister along the endless road to class. 2 years earlier, he had dropped out entirely. The walk had grown too long, the heat too brutal. By the time he reached school half the morning, lessons were already lost, and the return journey under the midday sun felt like a punishment without end. His parents urged him to stay in school, but the land demanded labor, and the road demanded too much of him. Now standing at the village edge, Musa watched the bus appear out of the morning mist. To him, it was not just a machine. It was a bridge laid down between a life he had resigned himself to and a future he thought had slipped away forever. The doors opened with a clean hiss, and he stepped inside with a mix of disbelief and reverence. The seats were firm, unscarred, the windows clear and bright. In just 20 minutes, he would be at the school gates, the same trip that had once stolen an hour and a half from every morning of his youth. Musa's story was only one among thousands unfolding across the country that day. Yet beyond Burkina Faso's borders in rural Kenya, Tanzania, and other corners of the continent, children still rose before dawn to begin their daily trek barefoot over rocky paths, carrying their lunches in battered tins, uniforms already dust-stained before the first bell rang. Kenya, with all its resources and international ties, had yet to match such a program on this scale. And so the question rose like a challenge carried on the wind. If Burkina Faso can achieve this without waiting for foreign approval, why not everywhere? What invisible chains keep the wheels from turning in other lands? Part of the answer lies in the kind of advice that arrives dressed in the polite language of efficiency. Not long ago, the International Monetary Fund suggested it would be more sustainable for Burkina Faso to outsource public transport to private contractors rather than purchase buses outright. On paper, the argument had a certain logic. In reality, it meant surrendering control over who could move, when they could move, and at what price. It meant the roads to schools, to markets, to hospitals would remain hostage to someone else's profit margins. Ibrahim Traoré's government rejected this. They chose ownership over dependency, permanence over fragile convenience. The resistance to that choice was discreet in public, but fierce behind closed doors. Critics called it reckless, predicting the buses would quickly break down, that the state would mismanage them, that the whole dream would stall in the dust. But in villages like Moussa's, where the sight of a bus meant the difference between a life tethered to the fields and the possibility of education, those warnings seem far away. Here the proof of change was something you could touch, climb aboard and ride into town. If you are watching this now, know that this is not merely the story of Burkina Faso. It is a question directed to every African nation, every leader, and every citizen who has ever been told to wait for permission. Share this if you believe Africa should draw its own roads, not trace the lines handed down by others. Let the sight of these 155 buses rolling through the red dust be a signal that we will no longer allow others to chart our journeys for us. As the bus pulled away from the village that morning, Moussa sat by the window, his school books resting on his lap. He watched the road unspool before him. The same road that had once stolen his time, now carrying him forward with speed and purpose. Fields rolled past in a blur of green and gold, farmers already bent to their work. Goats scattered at the growl of the engine, and children along the roadside waved with both hands as though their joy alone could push the bus faster. The road ahead had been newly graded and leveled for this route, its edges lined with fresh gravel that caught the sun. It was smooth now, but in the distance the path curved toward low hills where dark clouds were gathering. The journey was only beginning, and not every mile ahead would be easy. That is where we now turn to the storms that rise when change begins to move. The buses had been on the road for only a few short weeks when the first whispers began to curl through the air like smoke. At first, they were small, almost harmless murmurs traded at market stalls muttered over small cups of tea in dimly lit cafes. People claimed they had heard from reliable sources that the buses were cheaply made, that the engines were not new at all, but second-hand cast-offs, and that within 2 years, they would be nothing more than rusting shells on the roadside. By the second month, the rumors had grown teeth. They were no longer casual comments. They had become a story with its own momentum. A group of entrenched interests, those who had made fortunes from the absence of affordable public transport, began to feed the fire. Sympathetic radio hosts repeated the claims on air. Anonymous articles appeared online and the message was sharpened to a single point. These buses were not a symbol of progress, but a reckless gamble that would leave the nation stranded. In truth, their fear had nothing to do with engines breaking down. It was about something far more threatening to them. The buses were dismantling their monopoly over the nation's mobility. For decades, transport in Burkina Faso had been a private game controlled by a small circle of powerful families and their foreign partners. Prices were set, high routes decided in closed rooms, and the people's ability to move was dictated by profit. Now, a publicly owned fleet threatened to hand the steering wheel back to the people, both in the literal and the political sense. The tension finally boiled over late one night in a meeting called at the Prime Minister's office. Around a long polished table sat ministers, engineers, union representatives, and regional governors. Stacks of reports lay open detailing deliberate misinformation campaigns, mysterious delays in customs clearing maintenance parts, and sudden coincidental fuel shortages at key depots. At the head of the table, Ibrahim Traoré sat in silence, absorbing every word. When the last report was read, he rose to his feet. His presence alone seemed to steady the air in the room. "These buses," he began, "are not just metal and rubber. They are the sweat and taxes of farmers, the earnings of market women, the hard wages of miners. They belong to the people, and as long as I stand here, they will be protected. We did not fight for these buses so they could be surrendered to greed. We brought them here to carry our children to school, to carry our workers to their jobs, to carry this nation forward. And no one inside or outside our borders will turn those wheels backward." The next morning, the capital awoke to the sight of the entire fleet lined up in disciplined rows, each one freshly washed, its white and green paint shimmering under the early sun. At the main depot, a pastor and an imam stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices carrying over the crowd. Together, they prayed. Christian hands raised to the heavens. Muslim palms open in quiet supplication for protection, strength, and unity. Drivers and mechanics bowed their heads. And in the brief silence between the prayers, the heartbeat of the city seemed audible. When does transport become dangerous? When it carries a people toward freedom. The enemies of this change understood that better than anyone. They knew that once the idea of public ownership took root in the mind of a nation, it could spread like the swollen rivers of the rainy season, unstoppable, overflowing every old boundary. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders came a different chorus, one of congratulations. The governments of Mali and Niger sent formal messages of solidarity commending the courage to invest in citizens instead of debt repayments. They spoke of a vision, an interconnected AES transport network where a student from Ouagadougou could one day ride a bus all the way to Bamako without stepping off, and where traders could move goods across borders without paying tribute to private monopolies. It was a vision that stirred both hope and unease. Hope among the people who saw in it a future where African nations were linked not by foreign airlines, but by their own roads and their own wheels. Unease among those whose fortunes had been built on the belief that Africans must always travel separately, pay separately, live separately. If you believe unity is Africa's strongest engine, write it in the comments. Let the world know that these wheels are not turning alone. They are part of a greater convoy, a continental march towards sovereignty. The prayers concluded, applause rippled through the crowd, and the drivers climbed into their seats. Keys turned, ignitions caught, and one after another, the engines roared to life. The sound was not just mechanical. It was a chorus, a defiant hymn, a rolling answer to every rumor, every blockade, every act, a rolling answer to every rumor, every blockade, every act of sabotage. The fleet was ready to move. And nothing in the air that morning suggested it would stop. And as those engines thundered together, another journey began. This time beyond the borders, carrying not just passengers, but a message written in motion. The morning the convoy set out, the sun had barely lifted its face above the horizon, brushing the savannah with strokes of gold and rust, as if the land itself was preparing for a ceremony. 15 of the new buses, polished until their paint shone like glass, stood nose to tail in perfect formation. Each one carried not only passengers and cargo, but a shared sense of purpose. The destination was more than just another Burkina Faso town. This was the first trial of the AES crossbar route from Ouagadougou to Bamako along stretches of land that had once felt more like walls than roads. Inside the lead bus, rows of seats were filled with students in crisp uniforms, their backpacks neatly resting at their feet. Some were on their way to Mali for exchange programs linking schools across the AES. Others were there simply to witness history with their own eyes. Beside them sat traders clutching baskets of fresh produce, rolls of fabric, and sacks of ground nuts. Beneath them in the cargo holds, crates of books, spare machine parts, and medical supplies were stacked tightly alongside boxes of mangoes. Each box carrying the sweet familiar scent of home. As the convoy rolled out of Ouagadougou, small crowds gathered along the roadside. Farmers stopped mid-swing in their fields to watch children wave both hands in excitement, and elders stood silently with the kind of nod that spoke more than words, a nod of recognition that something had shifted. The buses moved like a single organism, their engines humming in steady rhythm, the AES flag fluttering proudly from each driver's window, snapping in the morning breeze. By the time the convoy crossed into Mali, it had transformed into a moving celebration. At the first market town past the border, the buses slowed to a halt. Passengers stepped down to stretch their legs, their feet crunching on the gravel road. Under the wide shade of a mango tree, a woman named Mayam sat with a tray of fruit. Her face broke into a wide smile at the sight of the school children. She explained how her own daughter Ika had once missed school regularly because the old village minibus was unreliable and charged fares her family could hardly afford. But now, she said, adjusting her bright headscarf, ACHA has not missed a single week. She leaves in the morning with the others, and she is home before the evening meal. I sell my mangoes here, and I know she is safe. Before, I had to choose between her education and her safety. Now, I choose both. Her story was not unique. At every stop along the route, there were voices like hers. Stories of opportunity returned, of connections that had been broken and were now repaired. In each town, the buses brought not just people and goods, but the quiet restoration of dignity. Word of the convoy spread quickly, carried by radio, social media, and word of mouth, not just through Mali and Burkina Faso, but across the continent. In Nairobi, transport officials reportedly began studying the AES model, debating whether a similar network could unite their own rural and urban communities. Yet, not every reaction was warm. The World Bank issued a statement of concern over the long-term sustainability of such publicly owned fleets, warning about maintenance costs and the risks of state-run operations. Why should a bus crossing a border inspire fear because it carries more than passengers? It carries ideas, and ideas once set in motion are harder to stop than any vehicle. These buses were proof that nations could link themselves without waiting for permission, without mortgaging their independence to distant lenders. If you are watching this, you already understand this is not only transport. This is the weaving of a continent. One route, one journey at a time. Share this video so that the image of this convoy, these flags, these faces, these goods moving freely can reach every corner of Africa, from the salt deserts to the deep Rhine forests, from bustling ports to the smallest mountain hamlets. Let people see what becomes possible when we build with our own hands. As the convoy entered the final stretch into Bamako, the road narrowed, framed by crowds on both sides. Traders held up their goods as an offering of welcome, children clapped to the beat of hand drums, and old men raised their walking sticks in salute. Some waved the AES flag while others simply lifted open hands palm to palm, as though passing warmth and pride across an invisible line in the dirt. In that corridor of hands and voices, the convoy advanced not merely as a line of machines, but as a moving message. The wheels turned steadily, carrying the sound of applause, and the image of a continent remembering that its borders were drawn by others, but its roads could be built by itself. Beyond the cheers and the waving flags lay the next challenge: to keep these wheels turning, not just for months, but for generations to come. The convoy's triumph brought a wave of pride across the nation. But pride alone does not keep engines alive. Victory on the road had to be followed by victory in the workshop. Within weeks of the first cross-border journey, attention shifted to a quieter, less glamorous, but equally decisive front maintenance. For decades in Burkina Faso, serious repairs had been outsourced to foreign companies with spare parts imported at inflated prices and repair schedules dictated by someone else's priorities. If the 155 buses were to endure, they could not simply be driven. They had to be tended to with the same patience and care a farmer gives to his most precious fields. That philosophy took shape in a new maintenance yard on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. It was more than a garage. It was a school, a workshop, and a declaration that the future would be built and repaired by Burkinabe hands. Here, teams of young engineers, many freshly graduated from local technical institutes, studied every curve and circuit of the fleet. Working in pairs, they crouched over open hoods, traced wires with glove fingers, tightened bolts with precise turns, and lifted panels to inspect the breathing of the hydraulic systems. Every motion carried the understanding that these buses were not just machines. They were the vessels carrying the nation's promise forward. By midday, the metallic rhythm of tools gave way to the hum of conversation and the gentle clink of spoons. The workers gathered in the shaded corner of the yard, sharing bowls of steaming to the thick millet porridge that has fed generations enriched with a fragrant peanut sauce. Between bites, the talk would drift from timets and torque measurements to something deeper: responsibility. One young mechanic, his hands still streaked with grease, spoke softly but firmly. "We keep these buses like we keep our own eyes," he said. "If we lose them, we lose more than transport. We lose trust." Around the circle, heads nodded. They all knew he was right. It was during these early days that a letter arrived from the International Monetary Fund. Its sentences were polished in the careful language of efficiency, recommending that Burkina Faso consider privatizing maintenance services for cost-effectiveness and operational sustainability. On the surface, it sounded practical, even helpful. But between the lines was the old pattern Africa had seen for generations. Surrender the tools, then rent them back at a price that climbs higher each year. The proposal was read aloud in a cabinet meeting. When it was done, Ibrahim Traoré leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable for a long moment. Then he spoke: "If we give them the tools, we give them the keys. We did not fight to bring these buses home so that someone else could decide when they move. We will train our own people, build our own workshops, and keep our own wheels turning. The cost of dependency is always higher than the price of independence. Is it cheaper to let others fix your dreams or to learn to repair them yourself?" The question was not just rhetorical. It was a challenge to every African government willing to listen. Because to hand over the responsibility of repair is to hand over the right to move and by extension the right to decide your future. And so the workshops grew. Local fabrication of parts began. Welding sparks lit the evening air as frames were reinforced and new components shaped. Partnerships with technical schools ensured a constant flow of apprentices, each one adding their skill, their ambition to the country's growing capacity. Bit by bit, the buses shed their dependence on foreign shipments. What once required a customs clearance now needed only a short walk across the yard. The pride this fostered was not shouted from rooftops, but it was deep and unshakable. In marketplaces and bus stops, people began speaking of the sons and daughters who kept the fleet alive. Parents boasted of children who could strip and rebuild an engine in a single day. Teachers told their students that knowing how to fix what you own is as important as owning it in the first place. If you believe Africa must own not just the wheels but the tools, type rise in the comments. Let it be remembered that freedom is not only defended in the open daylight of the road. It is preserved in the quiet oils and hours of the workshop, in the grease beneath fingernails, in the discipline to care for what we have built with our own hands. One late afternoon, as the sun slipped toward the horizon, and long shadows stretched across the yard. The distant ring of a bell floated in on the wind. It was not a factory shift bell, nor a call to prayer. It was the bell of a school marking the end of the day. Across the city, students were stepping off the buses, their laughter spilling into the streets. In the villages, engines eased to a low idle before falling silent, releasing children back into the arms of their families. The sound was a quiet reminder. Every repair, every drop of sweat, every hour spent under the hood was never just for the bus itself. It was for the journeys made possible and for the future those journeys would carry. On the far horizon where the light was fading, another challenge was already waiting. One that no wrench could tighten, but one that unity could answer. 155 buses, 250,000 students. On paper, they may appear as nothing more than transport statistics, neat numbers that could fit inside a government report. But if you have followed this journey from the first wheels turn to this moment, you know they are far more than that. These figures are not just about moving bodies from one point to another. They are about moving the very soul of a nation, lifting it from the weight of resignation into the blaze of renewal. They are the pulse of a people reclaiming the right to chart their own course. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, these buses have transcended their steel paint and wheels. They have become living chapters in the unfolding story of Burkina Faso. Latest news. A story not dictated by foreign press briefings, but written in the callous hands, determined voices, and unbroken will of those who ride them, repair them, and stand guard over them. Each dawn, when the engines hum together in harmony, it is not merely a fleet heading out to work. It is the sound of a continent reminding itself that progress is not a gift handed down, but a prize claimed by those willing to fight for it. Yet, we must keep our vision sharp. History is clear. Victories like these are never beyond reach of those who thrive on our dependence. The same forces that once told us to rent our future rather than build it will return cloaked in polite offers and helpful contracts. They will whisper doubts into our ears, sow quiet divisions among us, and present deals that sparkle like gifts but shackle like chains. The danger does not always arrive from across the border. It can come from within, from those ready to trade tomorrow's strength for today's comfort. This is why unity is not simply desirable. It is the fuel in the tank, the oil in the gears, the very thing that keeps these wheels moving forward. If the journey of Burkina Faso latest news has taught us anything, it is that a determined people standing firm behind a leader who refuses to bow can shatter the limits set for them. Ibrahim Traoré's refusal to surrender ownership not just of the buses but of the routes, the workshops and the vision itself is a living blueprint for every African nation daring to break the cycle of dependency. Understand this. This is not the end of the road. This is the gateway to 1,000 more. Picture a day when buses like these glide daily across the Sahel, connecting classrooms in Ouagadougou to science labs in Bamako, linking markets in Name to ports in Dar. Imagine a morning when no African child wakes up wondering if they will make it to school because transportation is no longer a privilege rationed out, but a right guaranteed. This future is not a distant dream. It is a station waiting down the line if we keep building together. If we keep moving as one. The challenge now is to protect what has been built. To see these buses not as fragile gifts to be admired, but as hard-won responsibilities to be guarded. To remember that what has been gained can be lost not only to economic sabotage or political interference, but to our own neglect if we fail to maintain both the machines and the spirit that put them on the road. The wheels are turning now, and they will not stop until every African child rides toward a tomorrow built with our own hands. But we must never forget the moment we release the steering wheel. There will be eager hands waiting to guide us back into the ruts of dependence. We cannot and must not allow that. Not now, not ever. If you are watching this, you are already part of this convoy. Do not let your role end here. Subscribe not because you need another video, but because you believe in a continental awakening. Share this message with your family, your neighbors, your community, so they too can see that Africa is not sitting still waiting for rescue. Africa is driving its own bus.